In part 2, we discussed Richard's fall from grace and the merciless Parliament, whose goal was to clean Richard's government of his friends. In part 3, we will see Richard's revenge and his downfall. June 7th, 1394, Queen Anne died. This seems to have broken Richard. He had truly loved her. She had been a voice of reason to Richard and had been a peacemaker in his court. When she died, Richard seems to have begun slowly losing his grip on sanity, as well as control of his temper. At her funeral, Richard struck the Earl of Arundel, who had showed up late, so hard in the face that he fell to the ground bleeding. After Anne's death, and the death of Robert de Vere, who had died in exile in France, Richard seems to have become more and more obsessed with Edward II. A bitter irony, considering where Richard's reign would end up. However, for the moment, Richard was reaching a high point in his reign. In 1394, Richard would lead an expedition to Ireland to establish more direct control there, which he would achieve for a short time at any rate. In March of 1396, a 28-year truce was established with France. However, peace and success were not to last. Richard was looking for revenge against the appellants. Gloucester, who had become the chief critic of the truce with France, spent most of his time in his own castle. Arundel and Warwick had been isolated from politics due to high-profile legal disputes and arguments with Gaunt and the king. The older appellants were slowly being cut off from the political scene, and any allies they may have had. On July 10th, 1397, Richard struck. The Earl of Warwick was Richard's dinner guest that night, and as dinner finished, the Earl was surrounded by Richard's men, and informed that he was under arrest. Right after this, Richard set out at the head of a party to arrest the Duke of Gloucester. They rode through the night, and at daybreak arrived at Gloucester's castle. They expected a fight, but Gloucester had too few men with him and was forced to let the king and his party inside. Richard greeted his uncle and then at once had him arrested and sent by ship to an English-controlled port in France, to be held as a prisoner there. The Earl of Arundel was persuaded to leave his place of refuge and was taken to the Isle of Wight, where he was imprisoned. This was to be Richard's greatest moment. In a parody of the merciless Parliament, Richard had 7 noblemen lodge a formal complaint against the Lords. Acts of pardon given to the accused lords after the merciless Parliament were revoked, and the lords were accused of every sort of treason and treachery imaginable. Gaunt presided over this Parliament as Lord High Steward. Gaunt likely was unwilling, but had no choice, as he had to protect his own son, Darby, who had been an appellant, and was only spared from Richard's revenge due to the king's favour for Gaunt. Thomas Mowbray was also spared, likely on account of his long friendship with Richard growing up. The younger 2 lords may also have been spared due to their siding with Richard in the case of Simon Burley. The elder lords, however, were not so lucky. On June the 21st, Arundel was brought before the king and Parliament for trial. There was no shock in the outcome. He was convicted of treason and taken out and executed the same day. The following Monday, it was Gloucester's turn. Thomas Mowbray had been sent to fetch him, but returned to inform Parliament that Gloucester was already dead. Though he did not say so, it is likely that Gloucester was killed on the king's orders. Gloucester was condemned as a traitor, and all his lands were forfeit to the crown, in spite of the fact that he was already dead. On Friday, September 28th, it was Warwick's turn. Unlike Arundel, who denounced the king and all who accused him, Warwick came begging for mercy, and confessing to anything that was demanded of him. After pleas from other lords in Parliament, Richard agreed to spare Warwick's life, but ordered him imprisoned for life on the Isle of Man, with the forfeit of all his lands. In a stroke, Richard had revenged himself on his chief foes. With the lands forfeit to him, Richard gave a considerable amount of it away to new favourites. Bolingbroke and Mowbray, both of whom had escaped Richard's bloody revenge for now, were both raised to dukedoms. Bolingbroke was made Duke of Hereford, and Mowbray was made Duke of Norfolk. There were many others who received rewards similar, but Mowbray and Bolingbroke are the 2 most important, as they would play a key role in Richard's downfall. In 1398, Bolingbroke and Mowbray would meet by chance on the road. In this chance meeting, Mowbray would confide in Bolingbroke that they were both marked men, in spite of the favor shown to them by the king. Richard was still hungry for revenge, it seemed. Mowbray claimed there was a conspiracy afoot to arrest John of Gaunt and both of the remaining appellants. Whether this claim is true or not is a matter of great debate. True or not, though, the claim was a very serious matter. If true, it speaks for itself. But if false, it would mean that Mowbray was trying to turn powerful nobles against Richard. Bolingbroke took this information right to his father. Gaunt advised his son to inform the king of this treason right away. Bolingbroke would accuse Mowbray of treason before Parliament and the king himself. Mowbray was at once arrested by the king, who, on the whole, seems to have believed Bolingbroke's story. However, Mowbray denied ever meeting with Bolingbroke, and it was decided that he could not be convicted due to a lack of evidence. It was decided that a trial by combat could determine the truth, though. On Monday, the 16th of September, 1398, Bolingbroke and Mowbray faced each other in the most anticipated duel, maybe, of all time. They were both fearsome fighters in the prime of their life. Bolingbroke may have had a slight edge, but it was only that. However, the duel would never happen. As Bolingbroke advanced to the attack, Richard stood up and called a halt to the fight, sending both knights away from the field of combat, while Richard conferred with his counselors. As king, it was within his right to settle this dispute as he saw fit. And so, in a move that must have seemed very fit and neat to him, he exiled both men. Bolingbroke, the man judged innocent, was exiled for 10 years, while Mowbray was exiled for life. It does bring up the question, though, of why you would exile an innocent man. Richard does not seem to have cared. The general public did care, however, and Bolingbroke had a great deal of sympathy as he left London to begin his exile. After this, Richard would become a tyrant, comparable to any king throughout English history. The only check left on Richard was the aging John of Gaunt. Gaunt's death on February 3rd, 1399, would prove to be a disaster for Richard. Gaunt had been a loyal prop to Richard his whole life. Richard had never had to worry about the vast power of Lancaster being used against him. And now he was faced with the prospect of Henry Bolingbroke, a former appellant, gaining the largest inheritance in the kingdom next to the crown itself. Richard began to fear the idea of Bolingbroke becoming Duke of Lancaster, and so he extended Bolingbroke's banishment for life. With this, Richard also removed the right of Bolingbroke to inherit the duchy. By removing Bolingbroke, Richard thought he had made his realm more secure than ever, and that no one would ever dare oppose him again. However, the opposite was true. Banishing Bolingbroke for life was felt to be an unfair act by most who were not in Richard's inner circle. What was more, Gaunt had been anything but a traitor, and repaying a lifetime of loyal service with the banishment and disinheritance of his only son caused a great deal of discontent. Banishing a man who was innocent was bad enough, but banishing a man whose father had served so loyally? It caused many to doubt if Richard could ever be trusted again. When Bolingbroke, an honored guest at the court of France, found out he was disinherited, it can't have been a shock. He knew Richard, and what kind of a man Richard was. More surprise must have been the news that came shortly after. Richard was going to Ireland again on another campaign. Bolingbroke could not believe his luck. England had been left without a standing army, and the king would be too far away to react. That summer, Henry landed with a small army of 300 men, but swiftly was joined by many, many more. When Richard heard that Henry had landed and an army was gathering under him, Richard hurried back to England, but found his own support base dwindling away. There are some estimates that Henry at one point may have commanded an army of 100,000. Whether this is an exaggeration or not, it's a sign that Richard was hated far more than loved. Richard would, in the end, fall into Henry's hands, and would be taken to London, where he and Henry had a fierce argument. Henry would try and persuade Richard to resign the crown over to himself, and so avoid the messy business of deposing a king against his will. In the end, Henry would present a document that was likely forged to Parliament, claiming that Richard had resigned his kingship. However, such a move is not in keeping with Richard's character. Parliament did not care, though. They would announce that Richard was no longer king and would offer Henry Bolingbroke the crown, after which Henry was crowned King Henry IV of England. Richard was now too dangerous to be left alive. A rebellion during Christmas of that year aimed to remove Henry and restore Richard. Richard was moved from the Tower of London and taken to Pontefract Castle, where he would be starved to death on Henry's orders. So passed the grandson of Edward III, a boy who ascended the throne amid hope unbounded, overthrown by his own cousin. Richard was not mourned much by his former subjects. Those who had gained titles and ranks from Richard may have mourned the loss of those titles, but very few Englishmen mourned Richard's passing. He is a complex king to delve into, as I have found through my research. He was a patron of the arts, encouraging building and writing throughout his land. He loved peace, yet he longed to avenge himself on those he felt were his enemies. He had a temper to rival any king in English history, yet also had a deep love for his wife. It is interesting to wonder how his reign might have been changed if Gaunt had been made regent until Richard turned 18. It's hard to see this hurting Richard, yet, unfortunately for him, we will never know how this might have aided him. Through his failures in government and his need for complete control of his kingdom, he managed to lose his crown. Yet, to call him the worst king in English history would not be fair, as that title belongs to one of his ancestors, King John of England, who is the topic of next week's video.